Hello and welcome to another All-Star Game event virtually done by Tattered Cover. We have a great panel here today talking all about the Negro Leagues. But before we get started, I just want to do some housekeeping. If you need closed captioning, there will be a black bar at the bottom of the YouTube video where you can click CC and you can have closed captioning. If you have any questions for the panelists, please ask it in the chat and I will get it over to our moderator. And then Tattered Cover, if you want any of their books, we have a plethora of great authors today who wrote books all about the Negro Leagues. Please check out tatteredcover.com, and that's where you can find our other all-star events. We have some in person that I want to highlight if you're here in Denver. We have Tim Kirchin and Buster Olney coming on Monday in person to sign their books, and Buster Olney's book was out of print, but we convinced the publisher to print a handful of copies for us. I'll put the link for our all-star events in the chat. But for now, I'm just going to turn it over to Ryan Mayer with CBS, who is moderating the event today, and he will introduce all our amazing panelists. Ryan, please take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Adam. Thank you to everybody tuning in and for my panelists also joining me here today. For the comeback season panel, we have four authors who have produced numerous baseball volumes and in particular with some big connections to the Negro Leagues and its players. Cam Perron, author of Comeback Season, the title of this particular live stream event. My unlikely story of friendship with the greatest living Negro League baseball players. Cam, thanks for joining me. How are you?
Good. How are you, Ryan?
Doing well. Also, Paul Dickson joining me, author of basically a full bookcase worth of books overall and a full bookshelf worth of baseball books, including the world-renowned Dickson Baseball Dictionary. Paul, thank you for joining me.
Welcome.
Ron Rapoport, also on our panel today, author of Let's Play 2, The Life of Mr. Cobb, The Life of Ernie Banks. Ron, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ryan. It's the legend of Mr. Cobb, the life.
The legend of Mr. Cobb.
I tried to differentiate the two.
My apologies. The legend of Mr. Cobb, The Life of Ernie Banks. Luke Epplin, as well, author of Our Team, the epic story of four men and the World Series that changed baseball, which just came out very recently. Luke, congratulations on the book being published, first off, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And Howard Bryant, as well, joining us, multiple-time author. His most recent book, Full Dissidence, Notes from an Uneven Playing Field, came out during 2020. Also wrote the book, the literal book, on Hank Aaron, The Last Hero, A Life of Henry Aaron. Howard, how are you? Thanks for joining us.
Good. And how are you? How's everybody?
Doing well. All of the books, by the way, that we just discussed here are available on tatteredcover.com, so you can feel free to check those out. So, guys, the first question that I wanted to start with, Major League Baseball in December of last year made an announcement that they were giving, quote, major league status to 7 of the Negro Leagues that operated from 1920 to 1948. And with that, absorbing the statistics and records of those Negro Leagues into Major League Baseball. And I wanted to start just first with the question of, when you heard that news, Howard, I know you've written on this for ESPN.com, just what were your immediate thoughts?
Oh, you're asking the bad guy first? I didn't like it. I wasn't a fan of it. I thought that there were other ways to honor Negro Leaguers. I just really have I guess I'm sort of a traditionalist when it comes to history. I don't like history sort of being scrubbed and rewritten, and I didn't really enjoy I didn't like what I'd heard from baseball about the reasons for doing it. I thought that baseball, from what I had been told, that one of the reasons they had done it was that this was an extraordinary year. And it was an extraordinary year, 2020, but my attitude was that if you're going to do this and mess with the historical record, then the year shouldn't matter. It's either the right thing to do or then not the right thing to do. So I had an issue with that. I think the biggest issue that I had with it was the idea that you can rewrite history with a pen stroke. I thought that these players had to carry the burden of being told they weren't good enough. And they had to carry being told that they were inferior and that their league was inferior. And if that is the legacy of the Negro Leagues, in terms of what Major League Baseball did, then I think baseball has to carry that too. The institution has to carry it the same way the players had to carry it. And I felt like there were other ways, if you wanted to honor them, that you could give them money, you could give them, work with the pensions, do something to really honor the players. I thought this was way more I thought this served baseball more than it served them. And I think the big thing for me, what really was problematic as well, was the historical record. Now, we all know the difference because we're still here. But 50, 60, 100 years from now, the history is all going to get blended in together. And some very important distinctions are going to be lost. You're going to look at the record. You're going to say, hey, that these guys were equal, that this league was equal, that league was equal. So what's the big deal? And you're going to miss the justification for the Negro Leagues for segregation was inferiority. You have to carry that. You can't just say, well, what are we doing? We're righting a wrong. It's a little more than that. It's a lot bigger than that. So I wasn't a fan. I wasn't a fan of it. I understood it. I didn't like it.
And Cam, for you, you had a relationship with so many of these players throughout the course of the years. And I just wonder, as Howard was just speaking about, they had to carry that burden of being separated from the major leagues. Just in your conversations with them and through the work that you did in getting some of them recognition from Major League Baseball in terms of getting them their pensions, what were those conversations like? Did you sense that same sort of burden?
Yeah, definitely. I'm overall in Howard's corner in terms of the thought on this whole thing. I think a lot of the players, they do like just the recognition. Okay, Major League Baseball is finally recognizing us. But for 60, 70, 80, is however many long years, Major League Baseball just threw them to the side. And now for Major League Baseball to all of a sudden, claim the Negro League as, their own, it's seems more of like a PR stunt to me. And then, again, knowing these living players that are still alive, they want more. They want money. They want additional recognition. There are very few players before 1948 that are even still alive. So it is a little bit of a slap in the face to the many players that played in the Negro League up until the early 60s, because the league was still going on. It didn't end in 48. And while the quality of baseball did decline as the major leagues cherry-picked all of the stars out of the Negro League, the league was still there, and it was there for a reason, because there were quotas in place, and teams would only have a couple players, couple black players in their entire organizations. So you're leaving all the Negro League players that are still alive kind of in the dust as well with that.
And Ron, speaking of players who played in the Negro Leagues after 1948, Ernie Banks was one of them, starting his career in 1950 before coming over to the Chicago Cubs. And I wonder, in the research that you did for your book, how did his experience within the Negro Leagues impact him throughout his playing career and then on later into his life?
Well, when Ernie got there in 1950, the Negro Leagues were dying. They died basically with one stroke. The minute Jackie Robinson integrated baseball, all the attention and all the interest from the black press and black fans were in Jackie Robinson and Satchel Paige and Larry Doby. One of the reasons that baseball said they didn't want to include statistics after 1948 was they weren't well kept. The black press wasn't covering them. Box scores weren't being kept, and so on. Ernie's experience was interesting. He was 19 years old. He grew up in a segregated society. He traveled a little bit playing semi-pro ball, but to come to the Monarchs was kind of a dream. And the idea, one thing that I suggested, Howard's point of view, is that maybe baseball thought that the Negro Leagues were inferior, but the players did not. They thought that they were playing great ball by themselves. There was even one quote, a player I'd never heard of, maybe Cam knows him, Bob Scott, who said he felt sorry for the white players. Because how would they know how good they were if they didn't play against the best? And the Negro Leagues had a lot of great players. They were proud of what they did. They were proud of the quality of baseball that they covered. Ernie's experience was interesting because he was so young, and he was taken under the wing of Buck O'Neill, who was his manager, and some of the great players on the teams, like older players who are not going to get their chance the way Jackie did. Elston Howard, who was Ernie's teammate, with the Monarchs the way Ernie did. And they didn't, these players didn't seem to be upset about it. They didn't seem to be angry. They took them under their wing. They taught them things, taught them how to play baseball, taught them how to carry themselves. Ernie learned a lot from Buck O'Neill. And in fact, when he finally got sent to was ready to go to the Cubs, he didn't want to go. He was a young guy. He was enjoying himself. You know, the teams traveled together, they ate together, they lived together, they played together, they went to clubs together after the games. He didn't want to go to Chicago. Or as a matter of fact, when he finally got there, there was a tremendous period of adjustment because after the games, the white players all went where they were going. And Ernie and Gene Baker, who they brought up so that Ernie wouldn't be the only black on the team, went to the south side of town, to the black neighborhood. And that was a hard thing for Ernie to get used to. So the Negro Leagues were important, and the players that they met taught them a lot about baseball and a lot about life. And that's how he felt.
And Luke, for you, one of the main people that you focus on within your book is Larry Doby, who integrated the American League by joining the Indians in 1947, just a few months after Jackie Robinson did. And I saw you speaking previously to Bruce Marcuson of the National Baseball Hall of Fame about the interaction between Bill Veeck and the Newark Bears owner as well, Effa Manley, and really how she felt about having previously had players just poached straight from the roster without any regard for the contract. Just can you speak a little bit to kind of that rating that happened to an extent by Major League Baseball of Negro League rosters?
Yeah, and I should just point out that Effa Manley was the owner of the Newark Eagles of the Negro Leagues. In 1946, the Newark Eagles had a bunch of players coming back from the war, and they had never won a pennant in the Negro National League, but they had a pretty powerhouse roster coming back with Leon Day, Monty Irving, Larry Doby, and presumably Don Newcomb, who was a 19-year-old pitcher at that time. He was still coming into his own, but his talent was pretty obvious to everybody. He did not report to the Eagles for spring training. If you look in the Effa Manley files of the Newark Public Library, Effa Manley is uncertain as to what is happening, and there are rumors going around that Branch Rickey has basically poached Newcomb from the Newark Eagles. Rickey did not hold the Negro Leagues in high esteem. He kind of thought of them more as a racket. He thought that the contracts there were flimsy and that there was no reserve clause in effect for these contracts. So once the season was over, they were essentially done and almost like free agents. So whenever he signed players in the winter of 1946 to be in the Brooklyn Dodgers organization, he did not bother to contact the owners of the Negro Leagues to offer them compensation for all the work they had done in scouting and developing these players. Effa Manley was infuriated by this. In fact, that summer of 1946, after Don Newcomb had been poached or raided from her club, she saw Rickey in the stands at a game and confronted him and basically said, if you poach any more of my players, I will make trouble for you. So whenever Bill Veeck, who was the owner of the Indians, came to Effa Manley and said that he would like to purchase the contract of Larry Doby, these were welcome words to her in a sense, because it was going to set another precedent for Negro League owners to be compensated for the development of these players. But Veeck offered her a rather low sum of $10,000 at first, that she knew that if Doby had been white, he'd be worth at least $100,000 based on his talent and what he'd been able to do up to that point. So she kind of felt caught between a vice there, where she wanted to set this precedent, but at the same time, she knew that that if she refused Veeck's offer and ended the negotiations, that she might be sort of seen as hindering Doby's progress into the major leagues. So it was a real vice that she was in. And then once she did end up sort of selling Doby, it did in fact cause fan interest to wane in her club. And within a year, she sells the Newark Eagles. So it was a real bind that Effa Manley was in.
And Paul, I want to bring you in on this question as well to get your perspective as a historian of the game, having researched so much on baseball over the years. Just what did you think about Major League Baseball and its announcement in the course of last December of recognizing these 7 leagues?
I'm with Howard and with Ron. I think it was ill-advised on several levels. The two names that came to mind when I heard that announcement was, how do you deal with something like the comparison between Ty Cobb and Oscar Charleston? And Charleston was one of his nicknames was the Black Ty Cobb, and they both had a certain dynamism, a certain ability to win ball games and to be very forceful players. And there's this one story that I read when I was doing some research on Charleston, that there were two exhibition games where Cobb was set to go up be in the same game with Charleston, and Cobb refused to do it. So how do you reconcile that? Because probably the data, the actual numbers we have on somebody like Charleston are miserably short of what he actually accomplished. He played in the Philippines on an integrated team. He was all over the place. But to try to nail that all down into a meaningful set of statistics, I think you carry that whole business of Charleston through anecdotes. This marvelous new biography of Charleston, which is dynamite. No, I don't think anybody could have imagined somebody coming up with the research that was done for the Oscar Charleston biography. I think the fact that Bill James rated Charleston as one of the top players of all top batters of all time. I think what Ron Rapoport has done, I think what a lot of everybody at this table has done, is I think the payback in terms of reputation and history is going to come anecdotally. It's not going to come from some numbers that are pasted in a book. I think it'll be carried by people like us. We will carry that forward. We'll preserve that.
Yeah, I also like to throw one thing out there too. I mean, Ron, I'm not arguing the fact that the players thought that they were major leaguers. The players knew they could play. That's not the point at all. To me, the point is that the very people now who are calling you major leaguers were the very people to their faces who were telling them that they weren't.
I agree with that.
And the record keeping was poor before 1949. The record keeping was poor after 1948 when they've got this arbitrary cutoff. And there were a lot of players that, especially Jackie Robinson, was infuriated about playing in the Negro Leagues because he knew it was inferior. He didn't think they were major leaguers. He thought they were good players, but he knew that the game was not being treated as major league. He knew that the number of games, he couldn't tell which game was an exhibition, which game counted, which game was a real game, which was a league game, which was a barnstorming game. And so he couldn't calculate his own batting average because he didn't know which games were which. And so the idea that the players understood how good they were is indisputable. And I don't dispute that. Of course, the players knew that they could play. The issue that I take with it is the carrying of the responsibility. Everyone has to carry their time. And Major League Baseball, if it's going to be an institution of any sort of repute, has got to carry its time for its own ancestors, the same way that Josh Gibson and those guys have to carry the fact that they didn't get a chance to play. And there's no way around it. And I think that there's, and I think to Paul's point, I would much, much rather have us think about Cool and have us think about Satchel and think about Leon Day and all those guys exactly as we know them, which is through anecdote, through story. That story of the Negro Leagues is far more important than whether their batting average was 320 or 325, whatever, because we really don't know that. But what we do know is those anecdotes are so powerful that they kept this thing alive, that people did respect them. And I think I just felt like I felt baseball was taking itself off of the hook. And I thought that there were other ways that they could have shown that the Negro Leagues needed to survive.
Well, you can never overemphasize baseball's ability to promote itself. And they've gotten into promoting things that they were, the antidote, the exact opposite of what they stood for 50 and 60 and 80 years ago. I will say, though, that the Negro Leagues and some of the research that I did about Ernie's in that time and the players that he dealt with, they had a lot of fun. They enjoyed themselves. Monty Irvin said The conditions were better and I got paid better in the major leagues, but I had more fun in the Negro Leagues.
Well, of course you did. Why?
All-Star game, for instance, was
Well,
a
exactly.
fabulous event. You know, the people came from all over the country. It was a huge event, and Duke Ellington and Lena Horne and Billie Holiday would all come to Chicago, and it was this huge outpouring, a great mass event. And I agree with you, we're all storytellers here. That's what it all comes down to me, is telling stories and the anecdotes. And I agree, it's going to be very hard to make these statistics mean anything. But to the extent that this encourages people to dig into statistics and to make that a part of what's going on, I don't necessarily see any harm in it. But I do think we should celebrate. Yes, it was segregated, and yes, it was awful. But like so much of Black life, they made it good for themselves. They enjoyed it. They played great baseball. The fans loved them. It was really a part of their community, and I think that's part of the story we can tell too.
And Howard, I want to come back to that point you were touching on in terms of some of the things that Major League Baseball could have done better in this instance in keeping that history of the Negro Leagues alive. But first, Paul, when you were mentioning anecdotes and Ron and Howard as well, that sparked something off for me because it is something that is so attached to the Negro Leagues. It's how we know so much about these players passed down years and years and generations later is these stories that have come out of those leagues. So I want to start first with Paul. Is there an anecdote that came from those leagues that time, the players involved, that really still sticks with you all these years later that maybe came up in research?
It's a hard question for me to ask because a lot of what I did was, I guess one of the things that really came to me was understanding Monty Irvin and his transition, and also I may be going a little bit off topic, but his position in World War II and coming back to the Negro Leagues. I think one of the reasons he didn't come up sooner was he was so profoundly affected by his experience in the Normandy invasion. He like Yogi Berra was in on the D-Day invasion. He came in a little bit later. Monty did, but Monty Irvin did. And I had a chance when I was working my Veeck book, I had a chance to spend a fair number of hours with him talking about all that. And I think what those guys overcame, something like Monty, I have one great story about Monty. I just have to tell it real quickly. He was talking about how tough it was to be in a very liberal New York suburb, but he was just still treated differently. He was captain of these teams, and he did everything well. And it was really clear that he got to be a junior, senior in high school, and he wanted to take Latin. The guidance teacher brought him in and said, "Look, that's not for you. You're going to probably have a great job somewhere as head of janitorial services in some industry or something. You're a leader and everything. But that's really for the more academic people." So he was denied taking Latin. So as he's telling this story, he's saying, "My quid pro quo," and and he was using all these Latin phrases. I said, "How did you learn Latin?" And he said, "As soon as I got in the military, I took a mail order course in Latin." But what I guess is beside your question, but these guys, even the ones that seem like were born with a silver spoon in their mouth, weren't, because the machine was still telling them what they couldn't do. And for somebody like Irvin to overcome that, and for all those guys, for Monty Irvin, for Larry Doby, when he comes out at Lubbock in that second season, when they're throwing rocks at him, and he's playing in Lubbock, Texas. They never threw rocks at Jackie Robinson. They threw rocks at Larry Doby. And so these guys, even when they came out of the Negro Leagues, they still had this, and not just Jack Robinson, he's the poster boy for the problems, but all these guys had problems, and all these guys were given short shrift.
Well, Howard knows what Hank Aaron faced when he was in the minors.
Well, Robinson, actually, if you really could make an argument that Robinson had it the easiest of all of them in a lot of ways, because Robinson had the entire New York press and he had an entire organization. Essentially, they built Dodgertown to protect their team and to protect him. He played, they did play their games in Cuba. Obviously, being the first, it was all kinds of the vitriol that he received was significant, obviously, but for everybody where nobody was watching, I mean, those guys. And not only was it the areas where no one was watching, it was also this idea that we have that now that we have Jackie, the problem is over. The problem was just beginning for those guys. So at no point should we ever think that, well, after Jackie, everything was kind of good, because those guys had it even more difficult because they were in places where nobody was paying attention. There was no media watching. There was nobody, the organizations weren't protecting them the way that the Dodgers went out of their way to at least try and acknowledge what Jackie was going through.
Well, when Jackie was in the minor leagues, they sent him out of the country.
Yeah, exactly. They sent him to Cuba. So,
right about that.
and to Toronto. I'm sorry, to Montreal.
But
Jackie also had a fast track to the majors compared to a lot of these other guys throughout the. Well,
that's right, and he was there 1 year, just one season, and that's. And one of the reasons he's in Montreal was to keep him out of Kentucky and to keep him out of those different places where, you talk about anecdotes. I mean, it's not a Negro League anecdote, but it's representative of what we're talking about. Was the great conversation that Felix Mantilla told me when they're sitting there talking to Hank Aaron. They're in Savannah or wherever they are when they're playing with Jacksonville, and the fans are chanting alligator bait at them. And Mantilla looks at Aaron and says, "What's alligator bait?" And one of the white players looks at him and says, "You." Yeah, and that's funny, but it's not funny.
Worse than that when he was in the 70s.
Yeah.
One great story. I mean, he had a fabulous season. He just tore the league apart. They finally, in some of the stadiums, they moved the line, the rope that separated the black fans from the white fans, over to let more black fans in because everybody wanted to see Hank. The great line somebody wrote was that Hank Aaron led the league in everything except hotel reservations.
And Luke, I know, touching off of actually what Cam was just saying about the fast track to the majors for Jackie Robinson, Larry Doby had much of a similar situation, and it was for the reasons that Howard was mentioning, because Cleveland didn't want him necessarily going to some of their minor league affiliates that were in the South, because they didn't want to put him in those situations. Just in your research, what did you come across that really stuck with you as you were putting together the process of writing this book and telling that story of him coming to the Indians?
It's just extraordinarily different than what Jackie Robinson went through when he desegregated the Dodgers. As Howard was saying, he did have a year in the minor leagues. It was a fast track, but at least there was a transition period there. Bill Veeck did not want to send Doby to one of the Indians minor league franchises, which were in the South or in Baltimore, which was a notoriously difficult place for black players at that time. And he also believed that the Indians, he wanted to just sort of bring them up right away. He wanted a pennant as soon as possible. He looked at the talent in the Negro Leagues and thought that they would be able to help the Indians right off the bat. So Doby basically has about 48 hours from whenever he finds out that the Indians are going to sign him to when he actually joins the Indians. In fact, he journeys directly from the Negro Leagues, playing on the Newark Eagles on July 4th, 1947, boarding a train that night, going overnight to Chicago, where he joins the Indians, and playing against the White Sox the very next day. Doby said that the transition was so abrupt and that he had sort of so little time to really wrap his mind around it, that the first 10 times or so he came to bat, he couldn't stop his teeth from chattering. And so some of the things that he is dealing with in that season is loneliness and alienation and just being away from his teammates and sort of given the cold shoulder and the indifference by everybody. He tells many sort of reporters from the black press that he would almost rather be at the Newark Eagles than dealing with what he's dealing with, because he's not playing. And as Howard also said, Jackie Robinson got a ton of attention from being in New York and from being the first. After that sort of first week or two when Doby is in the Indians, the press kind of goes away, and Doby is forced to deal with this in a much smaller market without that attention. And so it's like the same stuff that is happening to Robinson is happening to him. He's hearing the same things, he's dealing with the same issues, but he doesn't have this sort of insulation that Robinson might have had over there in Brooklyn. So Doby always claims that he had it just as bad, but perhaps I don't know, possibly even worse.
And Cam, sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Oh, I was just going to say, when Veeck decides to get out because of Doby, and then later because of Page, he decides to get out of Florida for spring training, goes out to Tucson, and then it backfires. Then things are worse. And Larry Doby's wife goes to get a glass of water. I guess she's pregnant at this point, at one of the hotels, and she goes to the doorman at the front of the hotel and said, "I need a glass of water. It's really hot, and I'm in Tucson." And they denied her a glass of water. I mean, every layer of this story, as Luke knows and everybody else at this table knows, every layer of this story is sort of layered with this animosity, this hate, this racism. You just can't imagine how they were able to lead a normal life after that. I mean, Doby did lead a normal life, but I remember interviewing one of his son and saying it was really tough. And as Luke knows, you know, when Veeck ends up at the Eastern Shore, he brings the Dobys down, and that's even there's this huge reaction that a white man will have a black family stay with him in a part of the old South, which was the Eastern Shore of Maryland at that point.
Well, spring training was its own problems. It wasn't integrated until well into the 60s in Florida. Wendell Smith, the great sports writer, was campaigning for years about these major league teams with black players had to live in different parts of the city in Florida and so on. And it very much happened in Arizona as well, as Ernie Banks and Billy Williams and the rest of the first black Cubs found out. Ernie wasn't allowed to stay in the same hotel for years. They played golf at a golf course, and the black players, when Bob Kennedy, the general manager of the Cubs, this is in the 60s, late in the 50s, finds out that the black players aren't allowed. He doesn't let the white players go. Well, they changed their policy right away. Billy Williams had to stay with a black dentist in Mesa, Arizona. When he got married, he was able to find a place to stay. Finally, Ernie was allowed, and some of them were allowed to stay in the hotel, as long as they didn't go to the dining room. I mean, it was crazy what went on. And this is 15 years after Jackie Robinson integrated baseball. Spring training was its own terrible situation.
And Cam, I want to bring you in here too, because you had distinct friendships with a lot of these players and had the opportunity to speak with them and hear their stories, not only just from the standpoint of what they went through during the course of their time in the Negro Leagues, but also trying to find and prove to people that they did actually play, because to Howard's point earlier, these leagues weren't covered in the same way that the major leagues were during the course of that time. So can you speak a little bit just about some of that research and how difficult that research was at times to find the proof, the box scores, the various write-ups of these games to show that these players, they played and their careers did happen to give them that proof?
Yeah, so like Howard said earlier, regardless of pre-48 or post-48, newspapers were not perfect. But post-48, there's a lot less articles that would list full box scores, full lineups. Let's say the Kansas City Monarchs in 1956 beat the Memphis Red Sox. They might only mention the starting pitcher and the losing pitcher and a guy that had a standout game. They're not going to mention the other guys that were there. So when dealing with a lot of the living players and trying to go back and find documentation for pensions and benefits, most of the living players, played in that post-48 period. And with that comes the difficulty in actually finding their name in an article. So if a guy says, hey, I played 5 years with the Memphis Red Sox and the Raleigh Tigers, I could go through every single article that I can find throughout that period. And 9 out of 10 times, it doesn't mention more than a couple people's names. So how do you find primary source documentation when these articles are an inch long? And it really just leaves a lot of guys just kind of, throwing their hands up like, I was there. I don't know what to say.
You got erased.
Yeah.
And that's the historical burden that you got to carry, that everyone has to carry.
And that's actually circling back perfectly to what you had mentioned earlier, Howard, in terms of, I did want to ask, what are some of the things that you would have liked to see, and what are some of the things that everybody here would have liked to have seen Major League Baseball do in terms of going further past just absorbing the records and statistics and saying that we recognize these leagues as major leagues, quote unquote?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember a couple of things as well, that as historians and people who really, really immerse themselves in the research and the people. I remember speaking to several Negro League players, back when, in the early 90s, Joe Black and Leroy Reams and a lot of those, and a few of those guys. And it's really hard to deal with from the standpoint that you have to remember where baseball is right now. Baseball is in the process as an institution of owning the word baseball. Baseball wants to control the minor leagues. Baseball wants to control the little leagues. Baseball wants to control the major leagues. Baseball is no longer making a distinction between the business of baseball and the game of baseball. That MLB wants to control essentially the game of baseball. And so you have the relationship between the Negro Leagues and the major leagues is becoming, it's an absorption, it's an annexing. So I think that the thing that baseball really needed to do, and I think they should have announced that they're going to keep the Negro League Museum. I think they should have just kept that funded in perpetuity, especially during COVID, because we all know if Major League Baseball is not writing those checks, that museum may close. We know that museum is in a really difficult spot in terms of making sure, like all museums are trying to stay open. So I think that was an important thing. Obviously, I think to Cam's point, which is really the most important point, that all the players who had to carry this burden, they're pretty much all dead. And the players who are alive, they're not covered under this statistically. And because the record keeping had virtually disappeared, Negro Leagues played until 62, I think was the last full season. And so they have to prove that they existed, which is very difficult as well. So I would have liked to have seen baseball try to do a little bit more financially for some of those folks, because they got wiped out financially. They're not subject to the pension. They don't get to enjoy some of the resources that baseball has. And the reason why I think that the resources are really important is because baseball is making a ton of money off Negro League memorabilia. And those jerseys in the Diamond, in the Cooperstown collection and all that stuff, there's money out there being made. Every time somebody buys a Homestead Grays jersey, somebody is being paid for this. So clearly, I think there was something that they could have done there. I think the other thing that baseball could have done that I would have liked to have seen as well is I think that baseball could have made a little bit more of a link between the pre-integration years in funding for research. I believe, and somebody here jump in, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there's like 48 minutes worth of footage of actual Negro League games in the world that's like known. And I'm about to go to the movies tomorrow to go see Summer of Soul, and this fantastic documentary about the Harlem music festival. And this footage has been sitting in somebody's basement for 52 years. So I would love to have baseball try to at least get involved and try to dig up and to really fund more research. Paul, I'm happy to hear about this Oscar Charleston biography, because this is how this stays alive. You need to really make sure that all the resources to find as many sources as possible have been exhausted, because as we know, once those primary sources are gone, it's gone forever.
I completely agree. I've been hosting former Negro League player reunions in Birmingham going back to 2010. And oftentimes we'll be down in Birmingham and we'll do a little news clip or a radio interview while we're in town, just kind of talking about the reunion. And oftentimes just from speaking on the radio or on the news, it'll get to a player, and the next day, a guy that we didn't know was alive will just show up to one of the events and introduce himself. And, for a couple guys to just go on the radio in Alabama and do a little talk about our event, that's bringing out players. I can't even imagine what, Major League Baseball could, pull out if they put in some resources.
Funny about players, about not being able to find references. One of the people I was happy to talk to when I was writing about Ernie Banks was Charlie Pride, who was a Negro Leagues ball player, made it to the minors, had a tryout with the Angels in 1961, didn't make it. So he went into another line of work where he did pretty well. But he would go every year to the Texas Rangers spring training. He was there every year. So 5 or 6 years ago, I caught him in Phoenix. Yes, he owns a home in Phoenix just so we can go to the Rangers spring training. And I told him what I wanted, and when I came, he had a whole bunch of clippings about himself. He had like 6 years in the Negro Leagues. So he had hung on to them. And it's possible that nobody else in the world had these clippings. And I was sitting there reading about, this young pitcher, Charlie Pride, who really could throw the ball really well. But he was proud of what he had done then, even after, he'd become one of the greatest country singers in the world. But it was interesting. It was just kind of interesting to see that. So, Cam, when you tell me that players come from out of nowhere when they hear about, what's going on and they want to bring you their own memories, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Charlie Pride, though,
I guess they better get going, though, because they're not going to be forever.
Yeah, out of the many players in the league in the 50s, though, Charlie Pride on the Memphis Red Sox, he was one of the main couple players that they would advertise for all their games. He was a star. His photo would be in the paper. And then, the rest of the team, they wouldn't really mention. So he did have that luckiness of, obviously he was a good ball player, but the fact that they did promote him in many of the promo materials.
I'm not surprised.
One of the things that's been really fantastic, and I use this a lot in some of the books I've written, is the digitalization of most of the Black newspapers, what they call the Negro press. And there were some very powerful newspapers in that, and some of them out of the way, the Norfolk paper, for example. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized there was still a huge amount of stuff that hasn't been digitalized. And I'll tell you an example, because I did it's a book I did on a totally other subject, but I discovered a magazine called Abbott's Weekly, which was owned by the Chicago Defender. And it was this beautiful magazine. It was on the level of sort of a Time or a Newsweek. It was a news magazine. Well, that's never been digitalized. And somebody came to me the other day and wanted to find a reference I have in one of my books to Abbott's Monthly. And I said, look, the only way you're going to, it's not even on microfilm. I said, the only way you're going to find it is one of the 2 or 3 libraries in the world that actually have bound copies that you can go in and look at. Yeah. And so the process of digitalization can have a huge difference here, but you really need people who have, not just people who are reacting to trends and things, but people who actually go out and look for this stuff. And then once they found it, digitalize it, get it, and then make it public and start to open this thing up. Another example is the Daily Worker. People might laugh, but there's a period when Mardo and these other writers,
well, they were the ones writers for integration before it was fashionable.
Right, and did phenomenal day-to-day baseball coverage, and the whole racial thing was very much in their sites, but that hasn't been digitalized yet. There are a whole lot of different subjects that have to be coaxed out of the woodwork, and then we can really start to get a better understanding of this stuff.
And I think that plays a little bit to what, Howard, you were saying about Major League Baseball putting more resources into research from prior to integration, prior to 1948, providing the resources. By resources, I mainly mean the money for people to go and do that research and that digitalization that, Paul, you were talking about. And Luke, I want to bring you in here too, and get your thoughts here on this piece as well, in terms of just what are some of the things that maybe you would like to see to get this era of baseball, which is so important, so rich in history, to continue to get more light shined upon it by some of the resources that Major League Baseball has at its disposal.
I don't know if I have much to add to that, what everybody is saying. Yeah, I mean, I think Howard has done a great job of summing up some of the things that need to be done. I mean, as someone who did a lot of research with the Negro League Museum in Kansas City, obviously making sure that stays quite funded and in the public eye would be wonderful. I don't know if there's sort of more ways of Major League Baseball to commemorate the Negro Leagues in some ways. We do have Jackie Robinson Day every year, but I just wrote a piece about how focusing so singularly on one player can have a tendency to eclipse or obscure some of the people that come after that. I think Howard had said it earlier too, that just because Jackie Robinson had broken the way forward doesn't mean that the problem was solved, or that everybody else after him had an easier road. And so I do think that, like, sort of expanding out the sort of commemorative process would go a farther way toward talking about the pioneers that came after him, and others that didn't even get their chance to go in.
Yeah, and that's what we do, though, right? That's what we do with pretty much all subjects. One of my good friends and guys that I look up to every day, David Marinus, was part of this yesterday, and David always says it best. History writes people out of the story, and it's our job to write them back in. And you see it on so many stories. There's Jackie Robinson, and then the story's over. There's Tommy Smith and John Carlos, and then the story's over. There's the Tulsa Massacre, and then the story's over. That's not the story. That's why we're here. That's what we do. And I would love to see some form of fellowship, grant, something. I know that SABR does its thing, just to really give people incentive to dig in on the research and to not lose sight of this stuff. Because my fear is that I don't worry whether Ron Rapoport knows the story, or whether Paul Dickson or Cam or Luke or Ryan, that you guys know the story. I'm not worried about that. We know that you know the story. I'm worried about our great grandkids and what stories they know, because they're going to look and they're going to see the statistics show Major League. And so that's going to require a secondary layer of research, because at first glance, it was all equal. And the thing that we know about time, as precious as we think time is, it really isn't. There's going to come a point in time when people aren't going to know this story, because time keeps going. And so that's why I keep talking about Major League Baseball letting itself off at the hook. And once again, I'd like to say something else about this, to not just be the buzzkill on this. There were a lot of people who were really pleased that baseball did this. There were a lot of people who felt like at the end of the day, this recognition had a lot of value. And I respect that. And I think that there is value in that. I'm worried about the method, but I do understand that when the story is told, it's one of the things I used to say about Buck O'Neill all the time, when everyone made such a huge deal about Buck not getting into the Hall of Fame and what that was all about. And I didn't turn this light on, so it's getting dark here. But the one thing that I always said about Buck was that, yeah, I thought it was wrong and he probably should have gone into the Hall. And I think they should have done right by him. But Buck got something that nobody else got. He got to see it. He got to live long enough for Ken Burns and company to celebrate him. He got to live to be treasured. And that is something that those other guys didn't get. And that to me is as valuable as any statistical recorrection.
Now, I want to, we got a question in from the audience watching the live stream here. And Cam, I want to toss it to you first, because you have so much interaction with the reunion and with these players on a year-to-year basis. Question comes in from Kelly, and it's, what can baseball fans do today to help former Negro League players, those still with us, directly?
Interesting. I would say they should definitely reach out to like their local minor league teams, to have like a Negro League night. That's probably one thing. Maybe have players come into local organizations. Most of these guys don't get pensions. Even if you could give them $500, $1,000 or something to just come in and speak at, your school, a local school or a local organization, just something to help them, make a little extra money, but also to tell their story and educate the public around them. I think that's probably a big one, just in kind of, allowing more people to hear the story and learn. Yeah, I would say that's probably the biggest one.
I think people really want, all of us want our lives to have had value. And I think that's where the pain comes from with a lot of these guys, this feeling that I was here and nobody saw me. And at any stage in your life, to feel like I've been seen is really valuable, and from a personal standpoint.
And in that situation, people can also connect with the player. They can hear their stories. They can meet them afterwards. And, little kids that are playing baseball can get some wisdom from this old former ball player. Baseball fanatics who've never played a day in their life can meet this legend that they didn't know about that lives, 2 towns over from them. So I think that that's a cool way for people to really learn the history and see somebody while we still can, because 10, 15, 20 years from now, there's not going to be many players left to tell their story in person.
Yeah, it's so funny. They were the two guys, Jim Robinson and Pistol Mason. We met with them up in Kansas City at the Negro League Museum. And I remember during the pandemic, I was watching a Toyota commercial. I'm like, wait a minute, that's Jim Robinson. They're both gone within a year. So as quickly, and you know, we got to meet him once in 2019, in the summer of 2019, pandemic hits. We're supposed to have this Negro League 100th anniversary, and both of those guys passed away too. So it's, you know, it's real stuff.
And building off of getting to know these players and continuing to learn the history. Alan had a question in here as well, saying, Luke, your book introduced him to Larry Doby, and while we should know as many Negro League players as we possibly can, he has a question of who else are some of the highlights, some of the other players that you guys would recommend picking up maybe books on to learn about.
I just read a biography of Cool Papa Bell that was absolutely phenomenal, and I'm sorry that I am forgetting the name of the author, but it was just published. I believe it was Lonnie Wheeler is the name of it. That was really phenomenal. There's just so many around. I mean, there is a new book by a woman named, I believe, Andrea Williams, who just did a book on Effa Manley.
Manley, yes.
Yeah, it's one of the best biographies I've read this year. It is really phenomenal. And Effa Manley, if you don't know, was the co-owner of the Newark Eagles, and she was just a spark plug as a woman who was in the sort of gentleman's club of professional baseball, not only holding her own, but at being extremely sort of strong and standing up for both herself and the Negro League, trying to strengthen it and doing what she could for her players. She's somebody I think who is getting the recognition now. That
there are now 3 biographies, Bob Luke's, Jim Overmeyer's, and the new one all on Effa Manley, and they're all. I've read the first 2. I've not read the last one, but they all have. She was a phenomenal woman, and her relationship to the civil rights movement and her leadership was just amazing. And so even if she hadn't been in baseball, she would have been worthy of recognition as somebody, as a true leader and as a true visionary.
Also a woman who played in the Negro Leagues, Tony Stone, who Martha Ackman wrote a very good book about, and it became a play on Broadway.
That's right. And the other 2, there are 3. I mean, that's what I find fascinating about this. And I was telling somebody at MLB, I said, you know, if you had extended out your list, if you had gone beyond 1948, you had something happen that would have been at a major league level that had never happened. 3 women on the field at the same time. And a battery, and Connie Morgan, Peanut Johnson, and Tony Stone all on the same field in 1954, Kansas City Monarchs against the Indianapolis Clowns.
Did Tony Stone play with Hank Aaron?
No, she replaced Hank Aaron. He got signed by the Boston Braves in '52. She came in later that summer.
What's interesting is that some of her experiences with the Negro League teams weren't very good.
No, the
managers, they didn't want a woman on the field a lot.
And who was the man? And it was the manager. The manager was Oscar Charleston.
You know,
go ahead, Paul.
So a book I always wanted to write, and I did a lot of research on it, and I still, and if you guys want my files, send me an email. But I was always fascinated with the relationship between Paul Robeson, who was among the first professional football players, and was the man who goes and testifies in front of Major League Baseball in '43, demanding the integration of baseball, and Jackie Robinson and their relationship, one being a Republican, one being a communist. Robinson testifying about Robeson before the House Un-American Activities Committee, but their parallels and their strengths as 2 human beings. And I think that's one of the stories that somebody's got to write.
No question about that. I'll be calling you.
What? Regretted testifying at that point.
I got a banker's box. You really want it?
Paul, write the book. Come on. What else have you got to do?
What? I'm I'm now reading books about World War II, and I just had a big one last year. And
I want to be first in line on that. We were talking about this in terms of whatever treatment it was going to be, book, film, something, because that relationship is fascinating. And that relationship is fascinating for a couple of reasons. One is obviously the 1943 Robeson meeting with Landis. Also, the fact that Paul Robeson played in the National Football League in 1922 and 23. And so before all the black players got kicked out of the NFL. And so it's a really interesting and fascinating story, even before you get to 1949, July 18th, when Jackie testifies against Robeson. And the fact that behind that, of course, is Branch Rickey, because Robinson didn't even want to do it. Campanella didn't want to do it. And so, because nobody wanted, I mean, Paul Robeson was, you want to talk about a towering figure in the black community. Why would you take on Paul Robeson? It's a fantastic piece of history that needs explication.
And Cam,
You got a box coming your way, Howard.
I'll send you my address.
Cam, I want to bring you in here too, because I do want to build off that question a little bit, just in terms of learning about the Negro Leagues overall as a whole and all of the complicated history there. Just what are some of the books that you were reading as you were continuing to dive more and more into the research?
I think there's the books like the Negro League Encyclopedia by Larry Lester and Dick Clark. You have Only the Ball Was White, which is like kind of one of the first kind of looks.
Yeah, Robert Peterson's book, yeah.
Back in the 70s, I believe. But then as I started to dig deeper, I really liked reading the books that the players had written. Buck O'Neill has a book, I Was Right on Time. Stanley Glenn, who played with the Philadelphia Stars in the 40s, has a book called Don't Let Anyone Take Your Joy Away. Bob Motley, who is the last living Negro League umpire, he has a book that came out maybe about 8 or 9 years ago. So I like intertwining kind of, the real history of the league and particular teams and stuff written, from researchers, but also to see it in their point of view.
And Bob Motley's son Byron is out in Los Angeles. Really good person to talk to about his dad.
Yeah, I know Byron.
Yeah. You know everybody. Of course you do.
I'm in LA too, so I've met him a couple of times.
Yeah, he's a good dude.
Well, guys, our time is coming close to a close here, and Adam's going to hop back on. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for the conversation. I've really enjoyed hearing all of your perspectives here and the discussion that we had.
No, thank you.
Good to be with you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you all so much. This is such an important topic that obviously is a hot topic right now because of what Major League Baseball did. I just want to mention again, you can get all their books at tatteredcover.com. Can you all, including you, Ryan, let us know where we can find you on the internet, what website, what Twitter, wherever you want us to follow you, tell us.
Google me, you'll find me. Rapoport.net/Ron.
No. I'm just sorry that we didn't get a chance to do this in person, because Tattered Cover is one of my all-time favorite indies, and especially because since I always covered the American League, we only got to go to Denver once or twice for interleague, so I've only been there once. And so wish we could have done this in person.
We should thank the bookstore for arranging this. All the panels that I read about just sounded terrific. You got a lot of heavy hitters, some of whom are on this panel. It was good.
It is good. You guys are tremendous.
Thank you all.
All right. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. You all have a great one. See you.
Yeah, too.